For some reasons we kept details of locations and address out. Be blessed as you listen. I was born into a Christian family, in a land where Christianity was not always welcomed, a Muslim country where open faith could easily cost a life. My father was a pastor and my mother a woman of great prayer. Their journey to having me was not easy. After they got married, 3 years passed and my mother did not conceive. In their culture and community, childlessness was like a heavy shame. People talked about them, mocked them, and some even whispered that maybe God had rejected them. But my parents did not lose hope. They went to the hospital and did many tests. Every report showed the same thing. There was nothing wrong with either of them. The doctors said they were both healthy and should have children. But no child came. So they turned to God in deeper prayer and fasting. They told me later that in their quiet time, God revealed to them that they already had a child in His plan. This gave them peace. Instead of listening to people's words, they chose to trust in God's promise. I was not there to see it, but I grew up knowing that my parents' smiles returned, not because the situation changed yet, but because they believed God had spoken. 5 years later, making it 7 years of marriage, my mother conceived. The day I was born was a day of great joy in our household. My parents named me Favor because they believed it was only the favor of God that brought me into their lives. Strangely, after my birth, they never had another child. I became their only one. They raised me with love, prayer, and faith. I grew up watching my father preach with fire and my mother sing with joy, and even as a child, I understood that my life itself was a testimony of God's faithfulness. After completing my university studies, life moved quickly. I met a young pastor named Richard. He was filled with passion for the gospel. I was 25. I knew deep inside that this was the man God had prepared for me. We got married in a small but joyful ceremony surrounded by family, church members, and friends. Soon after, the church sent us to a city far away from my parents. It was not an easy move, but Richard and I trusted that God had placed us there for a reason. Like every young couple, we dreamed of raising children. But months passed, then years, and nothing happened. We decided to go to the hospital for tests, just like my parents once did. Again, the results came back the same. Both of us were healthy. There was no reason, medically speaking, why we could not have children. I remembered my parents' story and tried to stay strong, but as the 4th year went by, my heart began to grow heavy. Richard remained calm, often reminding me that our marriage was first about serving God, not only about raising children. Yet as a woman, I sometimes cried when no one saw me. The pressure from people was not small either. Church members would ask quietly if I was pregnant yet, relatives would drop hints, and some people even said maybe something was wrong with me. But Richard and I decided we would not let people's voices control our hearts. We began to pray and fast, choosing to trust God even when nothing made sense. One evening, when my heart was especially heavy, I decided to travel back to my parents' city. I needed to talk to my mother and father, because I knew they understood my pain more than anyone else. When I sat before them, I told them about all the hospital tests that showed nothing was wrong with Richard or me, yet still no child. I poured out my worries, my sleepless nights, and my fear that maybe God had forgotten me. My father listened quietly. He was older now, his voice softer than when I was a child, but his words carried weight. He reminded me that they too had been in the same situation, 7 long years of waiting, yet God was faithful. My mother added gently that sometimes God allows delay not because He has abandoned us, but because He wants to teach us patience and reveal His glory at the right time. They both encouraged me to keep trusting, to not allow people's opinions to steal my peace. If you haven't subscribed yet, we'd love for you to be part of this journey. Our community is growing, and it's filled with people who, like you, are searching for truth and hope. This testimony isn't just another story, It's one of those rare journeys that challenges everything you thought you knew and opens your heart to something greater. I left their house feeling strengthened, as if fresh oil had been poured into my weary heart. For the first time in many months, I smiled genuinely and thanked God for giving me parents who had walked this same road before me. But only 3 weeks later, sorrow struck. Richard received a call one night. My father had fallen ill suddenly and passed away. The news crushed me. I wept bitterly, not just because I had lost my father, but because he had been my encourager, my voice of hope. At the funeral, many people comforted me, but my heart still ached deeply. I wished he had lived longer to see me become a mother. Yet even in my grief, I remembered his last words to me, "Trust God. He is faithful." Those words became like a lamp to me in the darkness of my pain. After my father's death, life slowly returned to normal, though the emptiness of his absence remained. Richard continued his work in the church, preaching with fire and visiting families, while I supported him with prayer and service. We never stopped praying for a child, even though years were passing by. Every night before bed, I whispered to God that if He could bless my parents with me after 7 years, He could also bless me. In the 5th year of our marriage, a miracle happened. I began to feel weak and noticed unusual changes in my body. Richard insisted we go to the hospital, and there, after many tests, the doctor smiled and said words that filled us with tears, "You are pregnant." I couldn't hold back my joy. I fell on my knees right in the doctor's office and thanked God. Richard lifted me up and hugged me tightly, whispering prayers of thanksgiving. 9 months later, I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. We named her Esther, because just like Queen Esther in the Bible, we believed she was born for a purpose. The news spread quickly in the church. At the naming ceremony, there was dancing, singing, and great rejoicing. Church members brought gifts, neighbors came with blessings, and many testified that our story gave them hope. For once, the shame of childlessness was gone, replaced by laughter and celebration. Yet, in the middle of all the joy, my heart quietly ached that my father was not there to see Esther. Sometimes at night, I would hold my baby close and cry, wishing he could have laid his hands on her and blessed her. But Richard, always gentle, would comfort me, reminding me that though my father was gone, God Himself was watching over our child. Esther grew quickly. From her earliest days, she was unusually confident. In church, she would sing loudly during Sunday school and answer questions boldly. Her teachers loved her so much that they often gave her small gifts, sometimes books, sometimes sweets, just to encourage her brilliance. Everyone admired her, and I often thought to myself that God had given me not just a daughter, but a shining light. When Esther turned 5, dark clouds began to gather over our land. In the city where we lived, hostility toward Christians grew stronger every day. A violent group of Muslim jihadists rose up, calling themselves the Purifiers. They believed it was their duty to cleanse the land of anyone who followed Jesus. Their attacks started slowly at first, burning a shop here, breaking into a Christian home there. But soon, the violence spread like fire. For an entire week, fear gripped the city. Christians were dragged from their houses and beaten. Some were killed in their workplaces. Children were kidnapped from schools. Entire families went into hiding, yet the government remained silent. The police responded slowly, and even when they came, no arrests were made. It felt as if we Christians had been abandoned. I remember one night vividly. We heard gunshots nearby, and Esther clung to me, trembling. Richard held us both close and prayed aloud, asking God to cover us with His protection. His voice was steady, but I could hear the weight in his words. The streets became emptier by the day as Christians fled to safer towns, but Richard and I stayed. He always said, "If God planted us here as shepherds, we cannot abandon the sheep in their hour of need." His courage inspired me, even though my heart quaked within me. Each Sunday, fewer people came to church, but Richard never stopped preaching. He would remind us that trials had always faced believers, but God's power was never diminished. Esther, though young, seemed to understand. She would pray in her small voice, asking God to keep bad people away. Her innocence pierced my heart every time. On the 14th day after the violence began, it was a Sunday morning. The streets were eerily quiet. I did not know that our lives were about to change forever. That Sunday morning started like any other. Richard woke up early as usual to prepare his sermon. Esther and I were getting ready for service when suddenly we heard loud banging on our gate. Before we could react, the gate was broken open and armed men rushed into our compound. They were the purifiers. Richard quickly pushed Esther and me behind him. His voice was calm but firm as he told us not to fear. The men shouted angrily, calling him an enemy of their faith, accusing him of deceiving people with the gospel. I will never forget the hatred in their eyes. Before Richard could even respond, one of them raised his gun and fired. The bullet struck my husband, and he fell to the ground instantly. My heart shattered. Esther screamed and ran toward him, but the men, seeing her movement, turned their guns on her. What happened next was beyond human understanding. They fired multiple bullets at my little girl, 5 years old, crying over her father's body. But none of the bullets touched her. They all fell to the ground, as if an unseen wall surrounded her. The men grew confused and terrified. They looked at their guns, then at each other, but none of their weapons could harm her. Esther, still weeping, lifted her head and looked straight at them. In her small, trembling voice, she cried out words that shook even me. She asked God to forgive them. The moment she spoke, something unseen seemed to strike the men. They froze, trembling violently. Some dropped their weapons, others held their heads as if struck by a sudden force inside them. It was at that very moment, for the first time since the attacks began, the police arrived. They found the men weak, shaking, and unable to resist. One by one, the rebels were arrested. I was still on the ground, holding Richard's lifeless body, torn between grief for my husband and awe at the miracle that had just saved my daughter. My tears would not stop. Esther clung to me, still crying, but I knew in that moment that God's hand was upon her in a way I could never explain. After the police arrested the purifiers who attacked our home, something astonishing followed. At the station, the men were questioned. I was told later by one of the officers who witnessed it that they could not stop shaking. When asked what had happened, they confessed openly that they had fired several rounds of bullets at my daughter, but none of them penetrated. One of them even said it felt as if the bullets hit a wall of light that surrounded her. As you listen, we'd love for you to be part of this moment. Tell us where you're watching from, and share what speaks to your heart. Your words don't just fill the comment section. They can spark hope, ignite faith, and remind someone else that God's love is real and still at work today. But it wasn't only the bullets they spoke about. They said that when Esther raised her head and spoke, something pierced their hearts. They described it as if an unseen force struck them inside, making them see their whole lives flash before their eyes. They admitted that guilt and regret overwhelmed them in a single moment, and that the words of a 5-year-old girl carried a weight they could not resist. Right there in front of the police, they declared that they no longer wanted to serve violence. They wanted to surrender their lives to Jesus. This confession spread quickly among the Christian community. Many were encouraged that even hardened men, trained to kill without mercy, could be broken by the power of God working through a child. For me, it was bittersweet. I rejoiced that God was glorified, but I still carried the deep wound of losing my husband. At night, I would hold Esther close, thanking God for sparing her, but weeping silently because Richard was no longer by my side. Sadly, our land was not merciful. Because the government and police were heavily influenced by Islam, the rebels were executed within 2 weeks. It was not so much because of the crimes they had committed, but because they openly confessed their desire to leave Islam and follow Christ. The government wanted to silence their testimony. My heart broke again, but I also believed in my spirit that they had truly found forgiveness before their deaths. Life after Richard's death was a valley I never imagined walking through. I was only 27, left alone to raise Esther in a city where dangers still lurked in every corner. At night, the silence of the house pressed on me. I would sit by Esther's bed, watching her sleep, and tears would stream down my face. Sometimes I asked God questions in my heart. Why had he allowed Richard to die? Why had he spared Esther so miraculously, yet not her father? In those quiet, painful hours, I felt God's Spirit comfort me. He did not give me answers the way I wanted, but he made me sense his presence. It was as if he whispered that Richard had finished his assignment on earth and was resting in glory, while Esther and I still had ours to fulfill. Esther, though only a child, amazed me with her resilience. She missed her father, of course, and sometimes she would ask why he was not coming back. But whenever I told her that he was with Jesus, she would smile softly and say, "Then he is safe." Her innocence taught me more about trust than any sermon I had ever heard. The church rallied around us. Members visited regularly, bringing food, gifts, and words of encouragement. Some helped me with Esther's schooling, while others reminded me that the testimony of her miracle had strengthened their faith. It was clear that though Richard had been taken, the work of God in our family was not destroyed. Slowly, I began to see that Esther's life was not ordinary. She was exceptionally brilliant, excelling in her studies, and carried herself with a confidence that was unusual for her age. Teachers in school and Sunday school adored her, often giving her small rewards just to encourage her. Wherever we went, people were drawn to her. And each time I looked at her, I knew she was a reminder that God's hand was still on us, guiding us forward. As Esther grew older, it became clearer that her life carried a special purpose. By the age of 6, she was already ahead of her classmates in reading, writing, and speaking with confidence. Her teachers often told me that she spoke with a kind of authority beyond her years. In Sunday school, she not only answered questions, but encouraged other children, reminding them to pray and trust God. The teachers would smile and tell me, "This girl is different. God has placed something heavy yet beautiful in her spirit." Sometimes, when I looked at Esther, I felt as though she carried both my faith and Richard's legacy within her. People loved her, not just because of her brilliance, but because she had a way of showing kindness even to strangers. I often remembered the miracle of that day when bullets could not harm her, and I realized God had preserved her life for something greater than I could yet see. Many times, in my prayers, I felt God impress upon my heart that Esther's life was going to touch nations. He let me know that though pain had visited our home, he had written her story before she was even born. I held on to this promise whenever fear tried to grip me. Through the years, I began to see a pattern. Where death had tried to cut us down, God planted seeds of testimony. Where sorrow had tried to drown us, he raised joy that could not be explained. And through all this, Esther remained the living proof that our God is still faithful in the darkest of places. As I look back over my life, from the story of my parents to my own journey, I can only say that God has been faithful. My parents waited 7 long years for a child, and God gave them me. I too waited, went through tears, and in the 5th year of my marriage, he blessed me with Esther. Though I lost my father and later my husband, God never abandoned me. Instead, he turned our deepest sorrows into testimonies that still speak today. I want every Christian who hears my story to understand this. Our walk with God is not always easy. Sometimes it feels like the night will never end, sometimes prayers seem unanswered, and sometimes the cost of following Christ feels unbearable. But God is always present. He does not forget his children. His promises may delay, but they never fail. When I saw Richard shot before my eyes, I thought my world had ended. Yet through Esther, God showed me that he is still working miracles. The bullets that could not touch her, the forgiveness that came from her lips, the trembling of hardened rebels, and their confession of faith, all these are reminders that no power of darkness can silence the light of Christ. Even though the government executed those men, I believe heaven rejoiced because they had surrendered to Jesus before their deaths. This taught me that God's mercy can reach anyone, even those who raise their weapons against us. So, my word to every believer is this: never let fear rule you. Trust God even when all odds stand against you. The world may rise with hatred, but God's power is greater. And just as He kept Esther, He will keep you and your children in His perfect will. Our Christian journey is not about avoiding trials, but about trusting God through them. And when you stand firm, your life itself becomes a testimony that will draw others to Christ.